And he had an explanation for the blood. He and his friends had decided to cut up a chicken and barbecue it for lunch, and that's why he was covered in blood. Earlier this month, October 6th, I woke up to tons of you tagging me in a tweet from TMZ saying that the case had been solved and the Zodiac killer had been identified. And it was very casual the way this was just dropped. A bit confusing. I'm gonna go over this new update. So the Zodiac killer case began in the 60s. Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday were on their first date. They were parked along a small pump station along Lake Herman Road, which was an area that a lot of teenagers would park. It was referred to as a lover's lane, and you know what they're doing there. And then around 11:20 that night, this young woman named Stella Borges was headed out to pick her son up from a show. As she turned on to Lake Herman Road, she spotted David's Rambler station wagon. However, the driver's side door was wide open and a young man was hanging out of the car, bleeding profusely. And then she noticed a young woman lying on the ground just a few feet away. Officers arrived at the scene at 11:28, and when they did, they found Betty Lou. She had no pulse. David was lying face up, hanging out of the station wagon. However, he was still alive, but barely, and he died before he even got to the hospital. Investigators on the scene determined that someone had shot at him and Betty Lou through the station wagon windows. And this was actually the first time that there were murders in Benicia for 5 years. So the local police there had no idea how to handle this situation. One of the big questions that they were trying to answer what were David and Betty Lou's plans for the night? And did they tell anyone about these plans? Was this predetermined, or was this a random act of violence? And it seemed like it was a random act of violence, that it was a double murder with no motive. Because there was no suspect, people were terrified, worried that this was going to happen every night, worried that this person was stalking their community. But for the next 6 months, things were pretty quiet. But just as people were starting to get comfortable again, 6 months later, the Zodiac killer struck again. Darlene Farron left home to pick up Michael Mijou. The two of them drove to Blue Rock Springs Park, which is another well-known lover's lane. And suddenly, this car pulls up, and this time someone gets out with a really bright flashlight and then just started shooting. And then quietly, calmly walks away, gets into his car, and leaves the scene. Multiple people in the area could hear the gunshots from their homes and called the police. Officers arrived at the scene at 12:10 a.m., and it's very eerie how it was found. The headlights were on, a turn signal was on, and music was still playing. Darlene was slumped over the steering wheel. She was actually still alive at this point, but barely. Michael had been shot in the jaw, in the shoulder, and his leg, but surprisingly, he was still alive and aware of what was going on. He was rushed to the hospital as quickly as possible. Darlene, unfortunately, didn't even make it to the hospital. Despite there being so many similar circumstances to the shooting that had occurred on Lake Herman Road, no one connected the two. That changed very quickly. At 12:40 a.m., someone called the police and confessed to being the one who committed the murders that night, and also said that they committed the murders on Lake Herman Road. So the police ended up tracing this call back to a payphone in a phone booth outside of a gas station. But by the time they got there, of course, the caller was gone. It became clear very quickly to the police that they were dealing with a thrill killer, someone whose only motive is to cause terror and pain. Plus, this type of killer is just bound to strike again. Now, luckily, Michael was able to survive the attack. He could describe the killer in more detail, and he said that he was a young white man, about 25 to 30 years old, with curly light brown hair, 200 pounds, and 5 foot 8 inches tall. So just a few weeks after the second shooting happened, strange letters started coming into the local newspapers, supposedly from the killer on August 1st. Now, each of these letters includes some type of coded message or a cipher. Then a second letter arrived at the San Francisco Examiner on August 4th, and in this letter, the killer identified himself for the first time as the Zodiac. This new name for the killer got around quickly, and wondering when he would strike again. And he did. 2 college students, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, had driven out to Lake Berryessa for a picnic. But pretty quickly after they got there, Cecilia noticed this man that was hanging out around the lake and seemed to be watching them. The way that he killed this couple just is so incredibly eerie. They are just sitting there trying to enjoy the view when suddenly the Zodiac killer appears from behind a tree wearing an executioner-style mask. He also had clip-on sunglasses, gloves, and military-style boots. And on the front of this executioner-style hood, he had a white cross circle, and this became the symbol of the Zodiac killer. He points a gun at them and orders them to follow his directions, and instead of shooting them like he had done previously, he ended up bringing out a knife and said he had to kill them. Before leaving the scene, the killer drew the Zodiac symbol on Brian's car with a pen. Sadly, Cecilia did not survive the attack, but Brian did. So he was also able to give them his description of the man: 5'11" and 170 pounds with brown slicked back hair. And just like the previous time, the killer called in again and confessed via payphone. And the payphone was just a few blocks from the police station, but of course, by the time they arrived, he was long gone. But this time, they were able to get a palm print. Okay, so now we're getting into the final confirmed attack. 28-year-old student Paul Stein was headed to work as a cab driver in San Francisco when he picked someone up who was heading to Presidio Heights. 10 minutes into the drive, the passenger asked Paul to pull over at a corner and, without a word, shot him in the back of the head. A witness saw him wiping up at the side of the cab before he fled the scene. And when police got there, Paul was already gone. They did stop a white male, someone who was described as walking briskly away from the scene. But this man ended up telling the police that he had seen someone running away from the scene, pointed them in the direction towards the Presidio, and they took off to pursue that and let this guy go on his merry way without any further questioning. Police were able to lift fingerprints from the blood in the cab, and based on the reports from witnesses, they created a composite sketch of the suspect. That was the last confirmed attack, but there are still other attacks that people believe are connected to the Zodiac killer. So Paul's murder was not immediately linked to the Zodiac killer. It wasn't until days later that the San Francisco Chronicle received another letter. The letter confesses to murdering Paul, and he claimed that he had been wearing a disguise this time, making their composite sketch useless. And then the killer confessed that he was the guy who was originally stopped by police, and he was able to trick them into thinking the killer had run off, and they all followed that direction. And to make this letter credible, the Zodiac killer included the piece of Paul's shirt. And the newspapers continued receiving letters from the Zodiac killer for years. In March 1971, a letter was sent to the Los Angeles Times, and it claimed that the Zodiac had killed 18-year-old college student Sherry Josephine Bates. Sherry's body was found between two houses very close to the library that she was studying at Riverside City College. And on the scene, detectives found a print from a military-style boot and also a Timex watch. And there was also hair found in Sherry's palm, likely from trying to fight off. A local newspaper received a typed letter from the alleged killer that said, "Miss Bates was stupid. She went to the slaughter like a lamb. I am not sick. I am insane." And at the time of the murder, the prime suspect was the campus library worker who was named Ross Sullivan. But police were able to eventually confirm his alibi and kind of ruled him out. But people definitely didn't. Another theory, which was presented by Robert Graysmith, who was the author of Zodiac, believe, along with many other people, that Arthur Lee Allen was actually the Zodiac killer. And he was actually the only person ever named as an official suspect in the Zodiac killer case. On September 27th, 1969, Arthur told his family that he was going scuba diving at Lake Berryessa. And this was the exact same day that Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were attacked by that hooded man. When Arthur got home that day, his clothes were covered in blood, and he also had a bloody knife in his car. And remember, the attacks at Lake Berryessa were the ones where the Zodiac used a knife. And he had an explanation for the blood. He said that he and his friends had decided to cut up a chicken and barbecue it for lunch, and that's why he was covered in blood. They also learned that Arthur was a gun enthusiast who owned a .22 caliber rifle. Plus, they ended up finding out that he wore a Zodiac brand watch, and he used to be a teacher before he was fired for misconduct. So at this point, investigators got a warrant to search Arthur's home, and it was creepy in there. They ended up finding several bloody knives. They also found several dissected dead animals in his freezer. And also they found some odd devices. However, they tried to do handwriting samples and they couldn't match his handwriting with his right or left hand to any of the Zodiac letters. Plus, remember, they had found fingerprints and a palm print, and it turns out his didn't match either of those. So then, jumping forward quite a bit here, in 1991, a police informant ended up claiming that back in 1969, Arthur had worked as a security guard at a strip club, and he had bragged about killing the cab driver, Paul Stein. Witnesses to Paul Stein's murder didn't identify Arthur as the killer, but Michael from the Blue Rock Springs Park attack actually saw the killer's face. And when he went in, he picked Arthur out of a lineup immediately. So authorities decided to search Arthur's home again, and this time they discovered homemade bombs and instructions that looked very similar to the ones that the Zodiac had written to them about several times. So Arthur ended up dying from a heart attack in 1992, and at the time they took samples of his DNA for future testing. In 2000, Detective Kelly Carroll and forensic document examiner Susan Morton started working to create a DNA profile for the Zodiac killer, and by 2002 they had a partial DNA profile. It can be used to rule people out, but it can't be used to fully identify the killer. And it turns out that Arthur's DNA did not match this profile, and at that point, he was ruled out as a suspect. But there have been so many other theories about other people who could have been the Zodiac killer as well. A lot of people out there think it's one of their parents. So the mystery has gone on for decades now, and so many people over the years have tried to decipher some of the codes that the Zodiac wrote in. A teacher and his wife solved one of them, and they did this in 1969, but the next code wouldn't be cracked for decades. In 2020, the 340 cipher was decoded on December 3rd by 3 people. Jarl, the computer programmer, designed a code-breaking app to crack the code finally. They sent in their decoded message to the FBI and the San Francisco Police Department, and later on, they confirmed that the 3 men had, in fact, cracked the code. And here's what it said. "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show, which brings up a point about me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise." So the TV show that was referenced in the cipher is actually the Jim Dunbar show. And 2 weeks before the cipher was mailed, someone actually called in and claimed to be the Zodiac killer. And what's interesting about that is the caller had actually asked for help in the call. However, police believe that this call may have been from a psychiatric patient in Napa State Mental Hospital named Eric Wheel. So now that we've kind of done a quick overview of everything, there's so much more. But let's go ahead and get into this latest claim. It actually came from a group called Case Breakers, claiming that they had solved the Zodiac killer mystery. The Case Breakers are an independent national task force of 40 plus cold case investigators, and the group just came right out of nowhere and said that they had identified the Zodiac killer and that it's a man named Gary Francis Post. So Gary was born in New York on November 8th, 1937. He had served in the U.S. Air Force and later worked as a house painter in Groveland, California. And on February 22nd, 2016, he was arrested for domestic battery. This was against his wife at the time, Mary, and at this point, he was 78 years old. And of course, people and the media were quick to point out the similar facial features between Gary and the composite sketch of the Zodiac killer. And people have really focused in on the lines on his forehead. But, I mean, many people have lines on their forehead. Hello? I got it from my daddy. The Case Breakers team also said that their years of digging has uncovered new forensic evidence and photos from Gary's darkroom. In 2017, a journalist named Dale Julin claimed that he had sworn statements from a man who had heard Gary's confession that he was the Zodiac killer. Also, 2 former cellmates of Gary's said that he had confessed to them and had also threatened their lives. Dale filed affidavits to get sworn statements, but the information in the affidavits couldn't be verified, so he was unable to do so. The case was actually brought to Case Breakers by one of their team members named Jen Buchholz, and she brought it to them after she read Dale Julian's copyrighted book manuscript. Now, details won't be available until this book is released. Before long, it was on headlines all around the world, trending on Twitter, and many of the articles and the way they were written led people to believe that the Zodiac killer had truly been identified and the case was solved. But Case Breakers actually have no connection whatsoever to the actual investigation. And a lot of people have been confused about why this made, mainstream news. Almost all of the coverage that came out initially was published with a headline that implied the Zodiac killer had been identified. And that, my friends, is called clickbait. And before all of this really came out to the public, there had been rumors going around about Gary Post being the Zodiac killer, and it did make it back to the San Francisco Police Department. So they ended up scheduling an interview at the jail where he was being incarcerated. But because this is an open case, no information has been released about that interview. Now, according to Case Breakers, Gary can be linked through forensic evidence to the 1966 murder of Sherry Jo Bates, who is just a suspected victim of the Zodiac killer, but not confirmed. And the forensic evidence that they are referring to is the hair that was found in her hand. The forensic evidence is being stored at the Vallejo Police Department, and investigators have not responded to the Case Breakers' request to test it because the Zodiac killer was ruled out in Sherry's case. The only thing that really linked the Zodiac killer to her murder was a handwritten letter supposedly from the killer that was sent to the Riverside Police Department in 1967. Years later, in 2016, a second letter was received by the department. The FBI was able to compare the two letters, the one from 67 and the one from 2016, and determine that they are the same handwriting. Apparently that person has been tracked down, and investigators ruled this person out as being Sherry's killer and the Zodiac killer. So without that 1967 letter, there is really nothing to connect Zodiac to Sherry. Officer Ryan J. Railsback, who is a spokesperson for the Riverside Police Department, said the only completely accurate statement in the Case Breakers press release was that the investigators are 100% sure that Sherry was not killed by the Zodiac killer. The police had announced that there was a $50,000 reward for anyone that could help them close Sherry's case. And eventually, they were contacted by a lawyer who asked if this reward would still be on the table if the suspect was dead. And after he read the recent Case Breakers update and realized that this lawyer who had contacted them was on the Case Breakers team. Now, Gary Francis Post actually died in a state-run facility in 2018. Fox News says they have tried to reach out to Gary's family members to interview them, and they've had no luck with that. However, a woman in California who lived next to Gary said that she believes, due to all the evidence that has come out so far, that he truly is the Zodiac killer. Her name is Gwen. She declined to give her last name, and she claims that Gary and his wife actually babysat her a few times when she was younger. This was back in the 70s and 80s. And she claimed that he had tried to show her how to shoot a firearm multiple times, and that he was also very abusive to his wife, Mary. Another woman named Michelle claimed that she was common law married to Gary. And she told Fox News that she was a victim of Gary and his posse several times during their relationship, including incidents of damaging her car and other things. Investigators say to this day, they still get at least 3 to 4 tips a week about the Zodiac killer, sometimes more, but they have pretty much shut down the claim from Case Breakers. And the San Francisco Police Department and the San Francisco FBI has confirmed that the case is not solved and that their investigation continues and remains open. When it comes to Zodiac killer, so many people have their theories and are stuck on a certain person or a certain idea, but truly, nobody knows, and I'm not sure if we ever will know. I think it's kind of sad that the Zodiac killer has been made into such a American horror story in a way, no reference to the show. But at the end of the day, these were real people who were murdered in terrible, terrible ways, and there could have been many more victims than we even realized. That is it for today's video, guys. I hope you guys stay safe out there,